A former detective's life was turned upside down after being accused of a crime he didn't commit. But the woman he saved took it upon herself to uncover the truth. Justice would finally prevail after years of injustice. But what surprise awaited them at the end of this story? Dan used to be one of the best in his field, a police officer and detective admired by everyone. His determination and sense of justice in fighting crime were well known. But one day his life turned upside down. After a major operation, a large amount of illegal money that had been seized mysteriously disappeared. The blame fell on him. His reputation and honor were tarnished by a carefully orchestrated setup. Somehow, part of the money was found in his car, though Dan had no connection to it. He knew it and so did those around him. Yet the truth never came to light. In a swift and ruthless decision, Dan was stripped of his badge. Once a hero to the people, he was now a disgraced man with a tainted name. The ordeal plunged him into a deep depression. As everything in his life slipped away, he saw only one way out: to return to his roots. In the small town where he grew up, Dan tried to start over with just two things left to his name: an old fishing boat and a tiny cabin, both inherited from his late father. He had already lost his family, so these were the only pieces of his past that remained, along with the painful memories. The townspeople believed in his innocence. They never doubted that Dan could never have done such a thing. But no one had the power to clear his name. Now, Dan was just an ordinary fisherman, waking up with the first light of dawn, filling his thermos with coffee and heading out onto the lake. But deep down, he carried a quiet rage. The injustice done to him grew heavier with each passing day. That morning, as he pulled up the nets he had set the day before, his frustration grew even stronger. Some of the nets were torn and the catch was disappointingly small. With a heavy sigh, he steered his boat back to the dock. The few fish he had caught weren't even worth selling to a supplier. Instead, he took them to the town market. Thankfully, they sold quickly, but the money he made was barely enough for a simple dinner and a few bottles of beer. Muttering to himself, Dan walked back to his cabin. His life now felt as small and lonely as his fishing boat. But behind the quiet solitude, a storm still raged within him. Because one day justice had to prevail. After spending yet another lonely evening in his cabin, Dan decided to head to the small town bar to clear his mind. When he stepped into the warm atmosphere of the bar, leaving the cold weather behind, a few familiar faces greeted him. After a brief chat with them, he found a quiet corner at the counter and ordered some food. The warmth of the coffee and the familiar smell of the bar lightened his mood slightly, but the emptiness he felt inside was still heavy. Just then the door opened and a woman walked in. Dan's eyes were immediately drawn to her. She had long, wavy blonde hair and wore a black jumpsuit that she carried with effortless elegance. Despite the cold winter night, she seemed to radiate warmth. Her delicate face was calm, and her fair skin glowed faintly as though untouched by the harsh weather outside. She walked toward the bar slowly, giving a polite nod to those around her as she sat down. She kept to herself, but her presence was hard to ignore. Dan watched as she took a laptop out of her bag and began typing. It didn't take long for him to realize she was an outsider. In a town this small, strangers always stood out. If she were a local, Dan would have known her. Everything about her, from her demeanor to her appearance, suggested she came from the city. She seemed completely out of place in the modest, unassuming bar. Dan couldn't take his eyes off her but tried not to stare, worried about making her uncomfortable. After fidgeting for a while, Dan finally gathered the courage to get up and walk over to her. He approached with a slight smile and said, "Hi, I'm Dan." The woman looked up at him and smiled back politely. "I'm Olivia. I'm here for a few days to get away from the city and clear my head," she said. Her voice was soft and warm, though it carried a faint hint of sadness. Surprised, Dan replied, "Interesting choice for a getaway." Olivia chuckled and said, "When I was little, my dad used to bring me here to fish. I grew up on a farm not too far from here and I've always loved this area. I thought revisiting my childhood memories might do me some good." Dan nodded, intrigued by her connection to the town. Something about her story struck a chord with him, but he didn't want to push his luck by asking too many questions. After a brief farewell, he returned to his seat, not wanting to bother her further. Later that night, Dan headed back to his cabin. He turned on the TV and settled into his chair, but his brief conversation with Olivia lingered in his mind. Her voice and calm expression had left an impression on him. As snow gently began to fall outside, Dan added a few more logs to the fire and let himself sink into the warmth of the couch. Watching the snowflakes drift down from the sky, he eventually fell into a deep sleep. The next morning, Dan was jolted awake by screams. A woman's voice echoed through the cold air. "Help! Someone help me!" "No." He leapt out of bed and ran outside. Looking toward the dock, he saw two young men tugging at a woman's bag. She was backing away in panic, inching closer to the edge of the dock. Dan shouted with all his might, "Hey! What are you doing? Leave her alone." Startled, one of the men yanked the woman's arm hard, causing her to stumble backward. She hit her head on the wooden railing and lost her balance, falling into the icy lake below. It all happened in seconds. Without hesitation, Dan dove into the freezing water. The shock of the cold pierced through him, but he pushed it aside. Opening his eyes underwater, he frantically searched for her. He spotted her a moment later, motionless, drifting beneath the surface. Fighting against the cold, he swam toward her, grabbed her arm and pulled her upward. Breaking through the surface, he dragged her back to the dock with every ounce of strength he had left. Somehow, he managed to lift her onto the dock before pulling himself up. Gasping for breath, he immediately checked her face. It was Olivia. The woman he had met at the bar the night before now lay unconscious, her head bleeding, motionless on the dock. Dan placed his fingers on her wrist to check her pulse. Relief washed over him, she was still alive. But her condition was serious and she needed help. As snow continued to fall around them, Dan looked down at Olivia's pale face and whispered to himself, "Don't worry. I'll save you." Dan recalled the emergency first aid training he'd taken years ago and sprang into action. Olivia was unconscious. He checked her breathing and listened for a heartbeat. She had a faint pulse, but it seemed like she wasn't breathing at all. Time was running out. Without a second thought, he began rescue breaths and CPR. With each compression, he felt like he was fighting for her life. After a while, some water came out of Olivia's mouth. Dan repeated the procedure and let out a relieved breath when she slowly started to breathe on her own. As her breathing steadied, Dan didn't pause for even a moment. The biting cold from the lake was threatening them both. If they stayed outside any longer, they risked severe hypothermia. He carefully lifted Olivia into his arms. Her wet clothes clung to her, leaving her icy cold. As Dan carried her, so vulnerable, his mind was focused solely on her safety. He quickened his pace to the cabin, kicking the door open as he entered. The comforting glow of the fireplace lit the room. Dan gently laid Olivia on the couch and immediately called 911. He urgently explained the situation to the operator and gave them his address. When he hung up, he noticed she was shivering. Her wet clothes were only making things worse. Dan knew, hesitantly, that he had to remove them to keep her from freezing. Working carefully, he undressed her and wrapped her in a long robe. Then he changed out of his own wet clothes and sat back down beside her. As the sound of ambulance sirens drew near, Dan went to the door and flung it open. When the paramedics came in, he explained everything in detail. She hit her head on the railing and fell into the water. I performed CPR. She's still unconscious but breathing, he said, his voice trembling with panic. They gently carried Olivia to the ambulance. Dan climbed in without hesitation. She was still bleeding slightly from the head and her face was pale. Seeing her in that state tore at Dan's heart. Once they reached the hospital, Olivia was rushed into the emergency room. Left alone in the corridor, Dan's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. As he waited, he replayed the events in his head, finding Olivia underwater, fighting to save her, and now waiting to see if she'd pull through. Dan pressed his hands to his face and took a deep breath. Trying to calm himself, he silently willed Olivia to survive, the weight of worry heavy in his chest. As Dan sat nervously in the corridor, the door to the emergency room finally opened. The familiar face of the town doctor stepped out. When the doctor saw Dan, he walked over with a slight smile. Hey Dan, I'm sorry about what happened. But don't worry, the woman's going to be okay. You did the right thing, you saved her life, he said. Dan let out a deep breath, feeling like the weight of the world had been lifted off his shoulders. Thank God, man. I was so scared, he replied. The doctor nodded and added with a serious tone, but she hit her head pretty hard. We'll need to keep her under observation for at least 24 hours to make sure everything's fine. Her condition is stable, but we need to be thorough. The doctor then looked at Dan and asked, and how about you? That lake is freezing, you might have caught something. Let's check you out. Dan shook his head and waved him off. No, I'm fine. I warmed up right away, he insisted. The doctor, used to Dan's stubbornness, patted his shoulder. At least have something hot to drink. You're a good man, Dan. You saved a life today. If you hadn't acted so quickly, she wouldn't have stood a chance. The doctor headed back into the emergency room, leaving Dan alone in the hallway. While he felt relieved, the sense of calm didn't last long. Olivia hadn't just been the victim of a robbery, she'd nearly died because of it. The people responsible for this needed to face justice, and as a former cop, Dan knew better than anyone how important that was. Grabbing his jacket, he set off for the town's police station with determination. At the station, he explained the incident in detail and gave descriptions of the two young men. He had seen them clearly and was ready to do whatever it took to help bring them to justice. After giving his statement, Dan left the station, but the unease in his chest hadn't disappeared. Unanswered questions nagged at him. Hoping to gather more information, he headed to the town bar to talk to some of his friends. At the bar, Dan shared the story with a few people he trusted. One of them mentioned seeing two young men near the lake earlier that morning, carrying a woman's bag. They also said the men had left on a red motorcycle. This detail piqued Dan's interest. Another friend recalled who the motorcycle likely belonged to. Without wasting any time, Dan and his friend headed to an internet cafe just outside of town. When they arrived, they saw a few young guys playing games at the computers. As soon as one of them spotted Dan walking through the door, he panicked and bolted toward the back exit. Dan didn't hesitate, he took off after him. The young man sprinted toward the woods, but Dan kept pace, determined not to let him get away. Finally, the boy tripped, and Dan seized the opportunity, grabbing him by the arm. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," Dan said, his voice calm but firm. Cornered, the young man confessed the location of his accomplice. The police were called, and both culprits were quickly apprehended. They confessed to their crimes, and the process for pressing charges began. As night began to fall, Dan called the doctor to check on Olivia's condition. The doctor reassured him, "She's doing well, but we're keeping her under observation. You can come pick her up tomorrow morning." Dan thanked him and ended the call. Exhausted from the day's events, Dan returned to his cabin. Sitting by the warmth of the fire, he replayed everything that had happened. He had saved a life and ensured justice was served, but he knew he wouldn't feel completely at ease until he saw Olivia fully recovered. The next morning, Dan woke up early and headed straight to the hospital. When Dan arrived at the hospital, he was filled with a mix of excitement and nervousness. But as soon as he saw Olivia sitting in her room, laughing and chatting with the doctor and a couple of nurses, he felt a wave of relief. Her face was still a bit pale, but she was smiling. Dan paused by the doorway watching the scene unfold when the doctor noticed him. "And here comes your hero," the doctor called out, gesturing toward Dan. Olivia turned her head, smiling, and her eyes lit up when she saw him. With a soft laugh, she said, "You're the only person I know in this town. So, it makes sense that my rescuer would be you." Dan gave a small smile and said, "It's nothing. How are you feeling?" Olivia let out a tired sigh, but her smile remained. "I'm doing better. My head hurts a little, but I'm okay," she replied. The discharge paperwork was handled quickly. The doctor advised Olivia to rest for a while and not overexert herself. Dan helped her leave the hospital. Together, they climbed into Dan's old truck and headed to the police station to retrieve Olivia's bag and belongings. At the station, a police officer handed over Olivia's things and with a friendly pat on Dan's shoulder laughed, "You really did our job for us. Caught the criminals and brought them in yourself." Olivia looked at Dan with a surprised expression. "Wait. What? You caught the guys?" she asked. The officer chuckled and said, "Oh yeah. And fast too. He's a former cop, a detective actually. This kind of thing is second nature for him." Dan tensed at the comment, his eyes narrowing slightly as he shot the officer a look. "It's no big deal," he said curtly, taking Olivia's bag and heading straight back to the truck. When Olivia got into the truck, she was quiet for a while, but she had noticed the discomfort on Dan's face. Her curiosity only grew. Breaking the silence, she asked, "Is what the officer said true? You were a detective?" Dan hesitated for a moment. He considered brushing it off, but Olivia's persistent gaze made him relent. Taking a deep breath, he admitted, "Yeah, I was a cop. A detective, actually. But that life is far behind me now." Olivia raised her eyebrows. "Why did you leave?" she asked, her tone gentle but curious. Dan was silent for a moment. He knew Olivia didn't mean any harm by asking, but revisiting his past was never easy. Keeping his eyes on the road, he finally began to speak. "During a big operation, a large amount of illegal money went missing. Somehow, someone pinned it on me. They found some of the money in my car, but I had no idea how it got there. The truth never came out. My entire career and life fell apart in an instant. I was kicked off the force and had to come back to my hometown." As his voice wavered, Olivia listened intently. "That's awful. But it's clear you're innocent. Didn't you try to find out who framed you?" she asked softly. Dan let out a bitter laugh and shook his head. No one wanted to hear me out. I was left on my own in the system. Now I just make a living as a fisherman. There's nothing more to be done about it. Olivia was quiet for a moment, processing the injustice Dan had endured. Then, in a gentle voice, she said, "But as we've seen today, you still have that same sense of justice. Maybe it's not something you should give up on so easily." Dan was struck by her words but said nothing. The quiet in the truck was filled with unspoken thoughts as they both fell into their own reflections. As Olivia turned to Dan, she said, "Thank you for everything you've done for me. I'm so grateful. But now, I need to head back to the city." Her voice carried a tone of farewell, mixed with firm determination. Dan gave a slight nod. He understood why she had to leave, but deep down he didn't want her to go. Dan drove Olivia to his cabin. While she packed, a short silence hung between them. Once ready, Olivia carried her bag to the truck and turned to say goodbye. "Take care of yourself, Dan," she said softly. Dan smiled faintly and replied, "You too, Olivia. Safe travels." But as she left, Dan felt an unexplainable emptiness settle over him. On the drive back, Olivia couldn't stop thinking about Dan and the injustice he had faced. Listening to his story had filled her with anger and a deep sense of justice. She couldn't shake the thought of how unfairly he had been treated. What Dan didn't know, though, was that Olivia wasn't just anyone. She was a successful lawyer with strong connections, thanks to both her career and her family. More importantly, her father was one of the most respected and influential prosecutors in the city. When Olivia reached the city, she went straight to visit her father. She told him everything, how Dan had saved her and the story of his wrongful accusations. Her father listened carefully and nodded. "The fact that he saved my daughter proves what kind of man he is. If what you're saying is true, it's our duty to uncover the truth," he said. Together they began a thorough investigation. Their first step was to track down Dan's patrol car's location on the day of the incident. It was discovered that his car had been parked in a mall parking lot. Olivia immediately worked to obtain the security camera footage from that day. But when she tried to access it, she found that the footage had mysteriously been erased. This raised suspicion and further confirmed Dan's claims. It was clear that this was part of a larger conspiracy. Olivia sought help from a friend in law enforcement who specialized in cybersecurity. Her friend managed to recover the deleted footage, and what Olivia found shocked her. The video showed a senior officer, still active on the force, placing a bag of money in Dan's car. The evidence was undeniable and could finally prove Dan's innocence. Olivia shared the discovery with her father, who immediately initiated legal proceedings and launched an investigation into the officer. Meanwhile, Dan remained unaware of all these developments, continuing his life of quiet struggle in the town. Everything was happening without his knowledge until one late night, a knock at his door changed everything. Dan woke with a start at the sound of knocking. Opening the door, he was surprised to see Olivia standing there with a serious-looking man by her side. "Olivia? What are you doing here?" he asked, confused. Olivia smiled slightly and gestured to the man beside her. "Dan, this is my father. He's one of the prosecutors in the city," she said. Her father stepped forward, extending his hand. "Thank you for saving my daughter," he said sincerely. "And I've also learned about the injustice you've suffered. It deeply moved me." Dan looked between Olivia and her father, still trying to process what was happening. "Injustice? What are you talking about?" he asked. Once inside, they explained everything: the parking lot footage, the discovery of the corrupt officer, and the steps they'd taken to bring the truth to light. Dan was stunned. Relief and anger surged through him at the same time. The burden he had carried for so long was finally being lifted. The prosecutor turned to Dan and said, "With this evidence, we're taking the case to court. The truth will come out and justice will be served." Olivia looked at Dan with a warm smile and added, "I did this for you, Dan. You deserve to have your name cleared." That night, Dan accompanied Olivia and her father back to the city. The legal process moved quickly. The evidence was so strong that the corrupt officer was immediately dismissed and eventually convicted. Dan not only regained his reputation but was also compensated for all he had lost. But for Dan, the greatest victory was having his innocence proven after all these years. After the trial, Dan turned to Olivia, gratitude shining in his eyes. "Olivia, I can't thank you enough. You gave me my life back. I'm forever grateful to you," he said. But Olivia gently interrupted him, meeting his gaze as she leaned in and kissed him. "You saved my life, Dan," she said softly. "And honestly, I haven't been able to get you out of my mind since the moment I met you. I just did what I'm supposed to do: fight for justice." Dan smiled back at her. I haven't been able to stop thinking about you either, Olivia, he said. This challenging journey had opened the door to a remarkable new beginning for both of them. Years later, when Dan returned to his job, he finally felt like the heavy burden he had carried for so long had been lifted. As he sat at his desk, there was a knock at the door. Olivia walked in, smiling with 2 coffees in hand. Coffee breaks on me today, she said cheerfully. Dan took the coffee and sat back. You brought justice and meaning back into my life, Olivia, he said sincerely. Looking straight into his eyes, Olivia replied, I knew from the very beginning that you were more than just a case. Dan smiled warmly. And you're more than just a lawyer to me. As they sipped their coffees, they both knew the bond between them had grown unbreakable. For both of them, this was the start of a brand new chapter. If you enjoyed this inspiring story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Stay tuned for more captivating and uplifting stories. Thank you.